On the morning of November 2nd, 1983, on an assembly line in Windsor, Ontario, a plain gold Plymouth Voyager rolled off the belt and into a parking lot. And nobody in that building had any real idea they were looking at the vehicle that would define what an American childhood looked like for the next 20 years. The smell of the vinyl, the sliding door that stuck a little in winter, the middle seat you fought your siblings for, the exact sound of a Fisher-Price toy sliding across the floor on a highway on-ramp. And here is the question that should bother you. Because it's the same question every family who ever owned one eventually has to answer. If this thing was so good, so beloved, so completely woven into an entire generation's memory of being driven somewhere by someone who loved them, why can you drive through an American suburb today and go weeks without seeing one? And why, when you do see one, does some small, unkind part of your brain immediately file the driver under a stereotype from 1996? Because the real story of the minivan is not really a story about a van. It's a story about two men who got fired for the exact same idea twice, and about how a country can fall out of love with the single most rational vehicle it has ever mass-produced, for reasons that have almost nothing to do with the vehicle at all. Start a decade earlier at Ford, where a product planner named Hal Sperlich and his boss, Lido Lee Iacocca, were pitching a low, boxy, front-wheel drive people mover they called the Carousel. A car-based van with a lower floor and sliding doors, built for families who needed a station wagon's space without a station wagon's bulk. And Henry Ford II looked at it and said no, flatly. And when Sperlich kept pushing, kept insisting the math worked, kept betting his career on a shape nobody else in Detroit wanted to build, Henry Ford II had him fired. That's the detail almost nobody tells you when they tell this story. And it's the one to hold on to, because it means the vehicle that would eventually save an entire car company was killed once already by the one company big enough to have built it safely. Iacocca followed Sperlich out the door a year later, fired himself in a boardroom power struggle, and the two of them landed at a company that was, by any reasonable measure, already dead. Chrysler in the late 1970s was bleeding cash so badly that it needed the United States government to co-sign its loans just to keep the lights on. A federal bailout, repaid ahead of schedule, that has become one of the great redemption arcs in American industrial history. And almost every telling of that redemption arc credits the K-Car, the boxy little Plymouth Reliant and Dodge Aries that kept Chrysler's lights on through 1981 and 1982. What most of those tellings leave out is that the K-Car wasn't really the destination. It was the chassis. Because sitting underneath that compact, unglamorous economy, sedan was a front-wheel drive platform that could, with the wheelbase stretched and the roofline raised, become exactly the shape Sperlich had been trying to build at Ford for a decade. And when he arrived at Chrysler and found that architecture already sitting on the shelf, he went to Iacocca and told him this was the moment. And Iacocca, running a company that had almost ceased to exist 18 months earlier, approved a $700 million bet on a vehicle category that did not yet exist, on a chassis borrowed from an economy car, at a company that could not afford to be wrong twice. Internally, they called it the Magic Wagon, and the men driving it toward production ran into so much institutional resistance, from a treasurer who told Iacocca flatly that Chrysler could not afford it, and from engineers arguing over how many doors it should have, that even a decade later, the people who built it were still telling stories about the arguments. And then it launched, as the 1984 Plymouth Voyager and Dodge Caravan, and something happened that essentially never happens in the car business. An entirely new category of vehicle, invented from nothing, became the single most profitable, most imitated, most culturally dominant product, an American automaker had built since the Model T. Chrysler could not build them fast enough. Competitors spent years trying to copy the packaging and mostly failed, because the genius of the thing wasn't the engine or the styling, it was the proportions. Car-like height for a real garage, a flat floor because there was no drive shaft tunnel to build one around, sliding doors that a parent could operate one-handed while holding a toddler on the opposite hip, and a price that sat, deliberately, right in the gap between a family sedan and a real cargo van. Within a few years, minivan wasn't a segment. It was a verb. It was what a household did when the second kid arrived. And this is where you'd expect the story to just keep climbing. And for about 15 years it did. Until, sometime in the mid-1990s, the minivan picked up a piece of cultural baggage it would never fully put down again. And this part matters more than the sales figures, because it's the part that actually explains the why it's gone, half of tonight's title. In 1995, a woman named Susan Casey, running for city council in Colorado, coined a campaign phrase to describe herself and women like her: overworked, kid-shuttling, practical, undervalued, and called herself, proudly, a soccer mom. And it was meant as a badge of honor, a claim on being taken seriously as a swing voter. By the 1996 presidential election, the phrase had been picked up by every major newsroom in the country as shorthand for a demographic that was going to decide who won the White House, and the image that came bundled with it, permanently, inseparably, was a specific one: a minivan idling outside a practice field, driven by a woman whose entire identity had apparently been reduced to a shuttle service. What started as an attempt to dignify that work ended up doing something close to the opposite. It turned the vehicle itself into the punchline, a rolling symbol of surrendered coolness, and it did this at the exact moment that a new shape was arriving in American driveways with the opposite marketing problem: too much personality, not too little. The sport utility vehicle sold rugged individualism off a chassis that was, underneath the fender flares, frequently no more capable than the minivan it was replacing. But it sold an idea the minivan never could, which was that hauling your children to a birthday party was somehow an adventure rather than an errand. And so a slow, brutal repositioning began. And here's the part with the actual numbers in it. American minivan sales peaked in the year 2000 at roughly 1.3 million units, the single best year the category would ever see, and then began an almost uninterrupted 20-year decline. Gutted first by rising SUV and crossover competition, and then nearly finished off by the 2008 financial crisis, when Chrysler's own minivan sales, the company that had invented the category, collapsed to around 90,000 units in 2009, an all-time low for the vehicle that had once been the most profitable thing the company built. Ford quit the segment entirely. General Motors, which had fielded minivans under 3 different nameplates, wound them down. By the late 2010s, industry-wide minivan sales had fallen to around 360,000 units in a single year, roughly a quarter of what the category had done at its peak, in a country with tens of millions more households than it had in 2000. And the vehicle that had once defined an entire generation's back seat had become, by every reasonable commercial measure, a niche product clinging on with 4 remaining manufacturers, while crossovers ate the rest of the market whole. That is the story almost every retrospective stops at: invented, adored, humiliated, dying. And it would make a perfectly tidy, perfectly sad ending, except it isn't actually the ending, because something has happened in the last 2 years that almost nobody talking about dead minivans has caught up to yet, and it's the reason this story doesn't get to end where you think it does. In 2025, American minivan sales rose by roughly 21% to just under 400,000 units, growing roughly 10 times faster than the overall new car market. And the momentum has continued into this year. The Toyota Sienna alone grew sales by more than a third. And minivans as a category climbed to their highest share of the American new car market since 2019. Some of that is Waymo, which has been buying tens of thousands of Chrysler Pacificas specifically because the low floor and